They told you Europe dragged itself out of darkness on its own. That's the fairy tale. Cold castles, candlelight, mud streets. Then boom, enlightenment, genius, progress, renaissance. Like Europe woke up one morning and decided to be great. That story sounds good. It's also false. Because before Europe rose, something had to arrive. And what arrived didn't come from the north. Here's the contrast they never show you. While much of medieval Europe was locked into feudal survival, Africa was already living a golden age. Not folklore. Systems, institutions, wealth, knowledge, organization, precision. And that golden age didn't stay in Africa. It moved. It crossed water. It walked into Europe wearing turbans, carrying books, blueprints, numbers, and laws. Those people were the Moors. And no, not the watered-down version you've seen in textbooks. Real Moors, African Moors, black and brown Africans from North and West Africa, heirs to civilizations that had already mastered what Europe hadn't even imagined yet. Here's what makes this uncomfortable. Europe didn't invite them for culture. Europe needed them for survival. By the early 700s, Europe was fractured. Local lords hoarded land, literacy was rare, medicine was primitive, cities were small and filthy. Knowledge was locked behind church walls, written in languages most people would never learn. Progress was slow because access was restricted. Then the Moors arrived, and everything changed, fast. Not because of violence, because of infrastructure. They didn't just conquer land, they reorganized it. They brought urban planning into rural chaos. They introduced paved roads, sanitation, street lighting, running water, things Europe would later claim as signs of modernity. But this was centuries earlier. They didn't just rule, they taught. Libraries exploded across Iberia, not dozens of books, hundreds of thousands. Medicine became systematic instead of superstitious. Math stopped being guesswork and became precise. Philosophy expanded. Agriculture transformed entire landscapes. This wasn't accidental growth. It was African systems being deployed on European soil. That's the part they skip. Because once you admit Europe's transformation came from African knowledge, the entire hierarchy flips. So history reframes it. They call it influence. They say exchange. They emphasize religion and ignore race. But influence doesn't rebuild a continent. Systems do. And Africa had them first. This is the peak they never want you to see. Because the Moorish project wasn't just impressive, it was efficient. It proved that African-led governance could stabilize cities, expand learning, and raise living standards across cultures for hundreds of years, 7 centuries. That's not a phase, that's proof. But here's where the tension sharpens, because access was the real weapon. Before the Moors, knowledge in Europe was exclusive, locked away, controlled. After the Moors, knowledge became structured, teachable, transferable. That's the fall point for the old order. When information spreads, gatekeepers lose power, and Europe learned quickly. The moment access expanded, Europe began catching up. Students traveled south to study under African scholars. Texts were translated, methods were copied, systems were absorbed. And once Europe had what it needed, the tone changed. The same African knowledge that was welcome suddenly became threatening. Because once Europe learned how to build, govern, calculate, and organize, it no longer wanted the teachers. That's the pivot they don't teach. Africa's golden age didn't fade naturally. It was pushed out, not because it failed, because it worked too well. And when the Moors were expelled, something strange happened. Europe didn't collapse. It continued on African foundations, same cities, same layouts, same institutions, new ownership. That's the twist. Europe's rise didn't replace Africa's golden age. It absorbed it, renamed it, rebranded it, and then erased the source. So when people ask, why don't we learn this? The answer isn't complicated, because this truth doesn't just add information, it removes excuses. It shows that Africa didn't wait to be rescued by Europe. Europe was rebuilt by Africa. And that raises one dangerous question they've been dodging for centuries. If Europe's progress was powered by Africa's golden age, why are we still pretending Africa had nothing to give and everything to learn? Let's strip the myth down fast. Europe didn't change because of ideas. It changed because of systems. And the Moors brought systems Europe did not have. Before them, European cities were accidents, narrow paths, waste in the streets, disease everywhere, no planning, no coordination, survival, not design. Then Moorish rule begins. Cities become intentional. Roads are paved. Waste is managed. Water is engineered. Public baths appear. Street lighting becomes normal. Entire urban grids are redesigned for flow, hygiene, and control. That isn't decoration. That's governance. You don't get that from theory. You get it from civilizations that already solved these problems. Africa had. The Moors brought agricultural science that multiplied food output, irrigation networks, crop rotation, new plants. Europe stops guessing how to feed itself and starts producing consistently. Population grows, stability follows. Then comes medicine. Before the Moors, treatment in Europe was prayer-heavy and practice-light. Disease was blamed on spirits. Surgery was rare and crude. Moorish physicians changed that immediately. Hospitals appear, real ones, with wards, trained doctors, and written medical texts. Diagnosis replaces superstition. Surgery becomes standardized. Hygiene becomes non-negotiable. That's not cultural flavor. That's a healthcare system. Now look at education. European learning was locked behind monasteries, Latin only, restricted, controlled. Moorish education was open, layered, and specialized. Libraries weren't symbolic, they were massive. Public access mattered. Subjects were organized. Students were trained in mathematics, astronomy, engineering, philosophy, law. Europe didn't rediscover knowledge later. It copied this model. Universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford mirror Moorish institutions. Same structure, same disciplines, same method. That's the part textbooks whisper about, because once you admit that Europe's intellectual backbone was imported, the myth of independent genius collapses. And here's the key point. None of this required Europe to become African. It required Europe to learn from Africans. That's the leveler. Access to systems changes outcomes faster than talent ever will. Once knowledge was unlocked, Europe could scale. But the price of that scale was silence. Because how do you explain that black and brown Africans ran cities cleaner, healthier, and smarter than medieval Europe? You don't. You erase them. You rename their work. You bleach the visuals. You shift focus to religion. You shorten timelines. And eventually, people forget who built what. But the stone didn't forget. The streets didn't forget. The institutions didn't forget. They're still there, which leads to the real question they avoid. If the Moors were just a temporary influence, why does so much of Europe still run on their designs? Let's be direct. Europe didn't leap forward. It was pulled through a pipeline the Moors controlled. When Moorish Africa entered Europe, it didn't just bring books. It brought translation, organization, transmission. That's the difference between owning knowledge and spreading it. Ancient Greek texts, preserved, studied, expanded in Africa and the Islamic world, while Europe forgot them. Aristotle, Hippocrates, Galen didn't survive in Europe because Europeans protected them. They survived because Moorish scholars did. Then they were reintroduced in Arabic, with commentary, with corrections. Europe didn't get raw originals. It got upgraded versions. Mathematics is the clearest example. Before the Moors, Europe struggled with Roman numerals, no zero, no positional value. Accounting was slow, engineering was limited. Then Arabic numerals arrive. Zero changes everything. Now calculations scale, architecture advances, commerce accelerates, navigation improves, science becomes measurable. That's not a small shift. That's a civilizational unlock. Astronomy follows. European sailors didn't suddenly become brilliant navigators on their own. They used Moorish star charts, instruments, and methods. The astrolabe wasn't a European invention. It was refined and taught by Moorish scholars. Without that, there is no age of exploration, no roots, no empires, no global dominance. But notice how that part is framed. Europe discovers the world, not applies African knowledge to leave its borders. Language matters. Chemistry, even the word, comes through Arabic. Alchemy becomes chemistry through Moorish experimentation and documentation. Controlled labs replace mystical guessing. Law evolves too. Contracts, property systems, bureaucracy, courts that function beyond brute force. Europe learns how to administer power efficiently. That's how empires last, not by swords alone, by paperwork. And this is the pattern. The Moors didn't just rule territory, they built frameworks. Frameworks Europe kept using long after the Moors were gone, which is why their removal wasn't just political, it was psychological. Once Europe absorbed the systems, it no longer needed the teachers, and teachers who reveal uncomfortable truths don't get thanked. They get erased, so the story gets flipped. The Moors become invaders. Their rule becomes occupation. Their knowledge becomes influence, small words, massive theft, and that sets up the final move, because once Europe takes the tools, it has to remove the evidence of where they came from. Once Europe learned the systems, the Moors became a liability, not militarily, narratively. You can't keep crediting African rulers once you plan to dominate Africa. You can't admit your science, medicine, and statecraft came from people you're about to label inferior. So the cleanup began. First move, remove the Moors physically. 1492 wasn't just Columbus, it was expulsion. Muslims and Jews pushed out of Iberia, libraries burned, scholars exiled, mosques converted or destroyed, knowledge pipelines severed. That part gets taught. What doesn't? The second move, remove them visually. African features softened in art, skin tones lightened, paintings reimagined centuries, later by European artists who had never seen a Moor in power. Statues recast, descriptions edited. Suddenly, the Moors looked Mediterranean, Arab, ambiguous, never black, never African. That wasn't accidental, because image locks memory. If future generations don't see African authority, they won't believe it ever existed. Third move, rebrand the knowledge. Algebra becomes European mathematics. Medicine becomes Renaissance innovation. Universities become Western tradition. The Moorish origin gets reduced to a footnote, if mentioned at all. That's how theft works at scale, not denial, dilution. And it worked. By the time Europe enters its so-called golden age, the narrative is set. Europe rose because Europe was destined to rise. Africa disappears from the equation. But here's the problem. Systems don't lie. European cities still sit on Moorish layouts. Legal codes still mirror Islamic frameworks. Scientific terminology still carries Arabic roots. Musical scales, agricultural techniques, even fashion. The fingerprints are everywhere, which creates a contradiction no amount of storytelling can fully erase. If Europe was always superior, why did it need African systems to function? That question is dangerous, so instead of answering it, history class skips past it. But now, there's a bigger issue, because once you erase the teachers, you also erase the context, and without context, people start believing myths, like the idea that Africa had no golden age, that black power is modern, accidental, or borrowed, that intelligence flows in one direction. Those lies don't survive scrutiny, which is why the Moors aren't just forgotten, they're avoided. And that avoidance tells you everything about how powerful the truth actually is. Next, we deal with the myth that really keeps this story buried. The idea that the Moors were just a minor chapter in European history. They weren't. They were the bridge. And bridges don't get remembered until they collapse. Calling the Moors a footnote is the biggest trick in the book. Footnotes don't last 700 years. Empires do. From 711 to 1492, Moorish rule shaped Europe longer than most European nations have even existed. England didn't exist as a unified state that whole time. Neither did Spain, neither did Italy. But we're supposed to believe the Moors were just passing through? That framing is intentional, because if the Moors are minor, then their impact can be dismissed. Their systems become coincidences. Their influence becomes background noise. But history doesn't work like that. Long rule equals deep change. Language alone proves it. Spanish and Portuguese are filled with Arabic-derived words, not slang, core vocabulary, everyday usage, words for food, science, governance, architecture. You don't absorb that much language from tourists. Architecture says more. Arches, courtyards, irrigation, city planning designed for heat, hygiene, and sustainability. Europe didn't invent that suddenly, it inherited it, and it kept it. Music, too. Scales, rhythms, instruments. The roots of European classical music trace back through Moorish Spain into Africa. Even church music quietly borrowed the structure. Then there's governance. The Moors ran multi-ethnic societies with legal systems that actually functioned. Muslims, Jews, Christians living under structured law, not constant chaos. That alone contradicts the myth of medieval Europe as morally advanced, because tolerance wasn't Europe's gift, it was Africa's export. That's uncomfortable, so instead, the story shrinks. Moorish influence, Islamic presence, brief domination. None of those phrases match reality. Reality is this: Europe's reset button was African. Without Moorish rule, there is no European rise as we know it, which brings us to the next lie, the Saitunoba idea that the Moors were foreign to Europe, outsiders who never truly belonged. That's a convenient story, and it collapses the moment you look at Bloodlines. Here's where the story gets dangerous, because influence can be denied. Blood cannot. The Moors didn't just rule Europe from a distance. They didn't sit on thrones surrounded by strangers. They married into Europe. They mixed. They settled. They stayed. 700 years guarantees that. You don't govern a land that long without becoming part of it. So when Europe later tried to paint the Moors as temporary outsiders, there was a problem. Too many faces didn't match the new story. Too many noble families had features, names, and lineages that traced back south. That's why race suddenly mattered. Early medieval Europe didn't obsess over skin color the way later Europe did. Religion mattered more. Loyalty mattered more. Land mattered more. Race became central later, when Europe needed a clean identity. That's when genealogies were edited. Portraits were altered. Records went missing. Families rebranded their origins. Darker ancestors became exotic, southern, or quietly erased altogether because a black or African ancestor didn't fit the future Europe wanted to sell. This wasn't paranoia. This was policy. After 1492, once Moorish rule officially ended, Europe didn't just change governments, it changed memory. Laws were passed targeting people with Moorish or African ancestry. Blood purity statutes appeared. Limpieza de sangre, clean blood. Think about that phrase. You don't invent it unless you're trying to cleanse something. Conversion wasn't enough. Christianity wasn't enough. If your lineage was wrong, you were still suspect, still watched, still limited. That tells you everything. The issue wasn't belief, it was origin. And the further Europe moved into colonization, the more dangerous those origins became. You can't dominate Africa while admitting Africa once dominated you. So the Moors had to become something else. Not African, not black, something safely distant. That's when the shift hardens. Moor stops meaning African ruler. It becomes Arab invader, then Muslim occupier, then just a shadow. Race disappears from the story on purpose. And here's the trick they used. They told you the Moors were mostly North African, and North Africa was different, closer to Europe, less African, more acceptable. But North Africa is Africa, always has been, and Moorish armies didn't come from one place. They came from across the continent, from the Maghreb, from the Sahel, from regions tied directly to Africa's earlier golden ages, Ghana, Mali, Songhai. This wasn't a random force. It was a continuation, which is why the knowledge they brought felt so advanced, because it wasn't new, it was inherited. African astronomy refined, mathematics systemized, medicine cataloged, philosophy preserved, all flowing north into a Europe that had lost much of it. That's the real reason the Moors terrify modern narratives. They prove continuity. Africa didn't wake up later. Africa was already awake. Europe was the student. And students don't like being reminded of who taught them, especially after they take the credit. So the Moors become strangers in their own story, foreigners in lands they shaped, invaders in cities they built, which raises the next question. If Europe worked so hard to erase Moorish blood, knowledge, and memory, what exactly were they trying to protect? Europe wasn't protecting history. It was protecting a myth that says progress flows north. That civilization is European by default, that Africa is a receiver, never a source. The Moors shattered that myth by existing, because their rule proved something Europe could never comfortably admit, that its rise was borrowed. Before Moorish rule, Europe wasn't leading the world. It wasn't innovating at scale. It wasn't exporting ideas. It was importing them from Africa. And once Europe realized that, the panic set in. You see it in the timing. The harder Europe leaned into empire, the more aggressively it rewrote the past. The moment it began conquering Africa, the Moorish chapter had to shrink. You can't justify domination if the people you're subjugating once governed you better than you governed yourself. So Europe needed distance, temporal distance, cultural distance, racial distance. That's why the Moors are locked in the medieval period, frozen as a long ago anomaly instead of a direct ancestor of modern Europe. Because if people understood that Moorish systems fed directly into the Renaissance, then Europe's greatest achievement wouldn't be purely European. It would be collaborative. And collaboration kills supremacy. Here's the part they don't like to say out loud. The Renaissance didn't spark out of nowhere. It was triggered. Triggered by translation movements in Moorish Spain. Triggered by libraries Europe didn't build. Triggered by scholars who preserved Greek, Roman, Persian, and African knowledge when Europe let it decay. The Moors didn't invent everything, but they kept everything alive. That's power. Control knowledge, and you control the future. Europe lost that control once before. It wasn't about to admit it twice. So Moorish contributions get fragmented. Algebra gets separated from its African path. Medicine gets Europeanized. Philosophy gets whitened. Architecture gets relabeled. Pieces survive. Context disappears. And without context, no one asks dangerous questions. Like why Europe suddenly advanced after centuries of stagnation. Like why so many foundational texts passed through Arabic first. Like why European scholars traveled south before claiming genius at home. Those questions threaten this narrative. So the story tightens. Europe becomes self-made. Africa becomes irrelevant. The Moors become a complication. But complications don't disappear. They resurface. In the buildings still standing. In the words still spoken. In the systems still used. That's why the erasure never fully works. And that's why modern Europe has an identity problem. Because deep down, it knows the foundation isn't clean. It knows the ladder was climbed, then kicked away. Which leads to the next layer. If Europe was protecting a myth of origin, who paid the price for that myth? And who benefited from the silence? Every myth has a cost. Europe's myth cost Africa its authorship, because once the Moors were pushed out physically, they had to be pushed out mentally. The land was reclaimed first. The narrative came next. And narratives don't rewrite themselves. They're rewritten by institutions, universities, churches, royal courts, later museums, then textbooks, then media. That's how silence becomes standard. Europe didn't just stop talking about the Moors, it replaced them. African scholars became European geniuses. African systems became universal discoveries. African architecture became inspired by antiquity. Notice the pattern. Credit travels north, origin disappears south. That wasn't accidental, it was profitable. Once Europe positioned itself as the sole source of progress, it gained moral authority. Authority justifies expansion. Expansion creates wealth. Wealth funds more storytelling, a closed loop. Africa, meanwhile, was stripped twice, first of land and labor, then of memory. Because if Africa had remained visibly central to Europe's rise, colonization would have been harder to sell. You can't paint a people as backward if the blueprint you're using has their fingerprints all over it. So Africa had to become timeless, static, primitive, while Europe became dynamic, modern, advanced. That contrast is fake, but it worked. Black descendants in the diaspora grew up learning that civilization started somewhere else, that brilliance came from elsewhere. that their ancestors were footnotes to someone else's story. That does damage, not just emotionally, psychologically. When people don't see themselves in history, they stop expecting power in the present. They aim lower, ask for less, accept more disrespect. That wasn't a side effect. That was the point. Meanwhile, Europe cashed in. Tourism built around Moorish architecture without naming the Moors. Universities teaching Western civilization that quietly runs on African foundations. Museums displaying artifacts divorced from African context. Africa provided the bones. Europe sold the museum tickets. And here's the irony. The very systems Europe used to erase the Moors rely on Moorish structure. Modern universities follow models refined in Moorish Spain, libraries, curricula, academic titles, even the concept of preserving knowledge at scale. Europe didn't destroy the latter, it repainted it and claimed it built it. That's why this silence isn't neutral, it's strategic. Because once people understand that Africa's golden age didn't stop at the Sahara, that it crossed into Europe and reshaped it, the entire hierarchy collapses. Suddenly, Africa isn't behind, it was ahead. And the question shifts from why hasn't Africa caught up to who slowed it down. That question is dangerous because it forces accountability. It forces Europe to admit dependency before dominance, and that's the line they refuse to cross. Which brings us to the final pressure point of this chapter. If the Moors carried Africa's golden age into Europe, why did Europe make sure Africa never carried it back out? Europe didn't just take from Africa, it blocked the return. Once the Moors were removed from power, Europe made sure that knowledge would never flow south the same way it flowed north. That wasn't accidental. That was strategy, because exchange creates equality, and equality threatens control. During Moorish rule, knowledge moved freely. Scholars traveled, texts circulated, ideas crossed borders without passports. Africa and Europe were linked through learning, not hierarchy. That had to end. After 1492, Europe didn't just celebrate victory, it sealed roots, burned libraries, shut down institutions tied to Moorish systems. Arabic texts were banned or destroyed. Scholars were expelled or silenced, not because the knowledge was false, because it was too true. Europe wanted monopoly, not partnership. So Africa's golden age was frozen in time, treated as ancient, finished, irrelevant, while Europe positioned itself as the future. That's when the lie of progress hardens. Europe claims linear advancement. Africa gets labeled stagnant, but stagnation doesn't happen naturally, it's enforced. Trade. Routes were disrupted. Centers of learning were undermined. External control replaced internal development. The same Europe that once depended on African knowledge now worked to make sure Africa couldn't rebuild that dominance. That's not coincidence, that's containment. And here's the quiet part. Europe didn't just fear African power, it feared African memory, because memory reconnects people to systems that once worked. Memory creates comparison. Comparison breeds resistance. So Africa's golden age gets fragmented into disconnected stories. Mali over here. Egypt way back there. The Moors treated as a European anomaly. Never a continuum, never a pattern, because patterns reveal intention, and intention exposes theft. Europe needed Africa to forget that its knowledge once shaped the world, including Europe itself. So education was redesigned. History was narrowed. Africa was reduced to pre-contact stereotypes. That's why the Moors matter so much. They sit right in the middle of the lie. They are the bridge Europe crossed and then burned behind itself, which leads to the final tension of this section. If Africa's golden age didn't disappear, if it was carried, used, and then suppressed, what happens when people start reconnecting those pieces again? Here's what Europe never planned for: reconnection. Because erasure only works while people stay fragmented, while Egypt feels separate from Mali, while the Moors feel separate from Africa, while Europe feels like the sole inheritor of progress. But once those lines reconnect, the illusion collapses fast. The Moors weren't an isolated miracle. They were the carriers of a system built in Africa long before Europe caught up, a system refined through trade, scholarship, and governance stretching from the Nile to the Atlantic. When the Moors crossed into Europe, they didn't invent a golden age. They transported one. And that's the detail that changes everything. Because if Africa produced the knowledge, refined the systems, and exported them north, then Europe's rise wasn't inevitable. It was conditional. Conditional on access. Conditional on learning. Conditional on African generosity, whether acknowledged or not. That's why modern narratives work overtime to break the chain. They isolate achievements. They treat Moorish Spain as a one-off anomaly instead of a transfer station. They disconnect African empires from global impact. But history doesn't obey borders drawn later. Follow the flow and the truth shows itself. Gold from West Africa funded European economies. Paper and numerals from Africa and Asia restructured European accounting. Medical texts preserved by African scholars became the backbone of European universities. Urban planning imported from Moorish cities reshaped European life. These weren't sparks, they were systems. And systems don't vanish, they get renamed. Europe didn't just learn from the Moors, it standardized what it learned. Then it locked Africa out of the same process. That's the part rarely discussed. Once Europe consolidated power, it stopped sharing the latter. Knowledge became proprietary. Universities became exclusive. Trade became exploitative. The same openness that allowed Europe to rise was denied to Africa afterward. That's not development. That's gatekeeping. And the psychological impact was devastating. Africa was recast as raw material instead of intellect, labor instead of leadership, resource instead of reference point. Meanwhile, Europe told itself a clean story. We advanced because we were smarter. We ruled because we deserved it. We led because we always had. None of that holds up under pressure. The Moors prove Europe wasn't always ahead. They prove Africa wasn't always behind. And that's why this story still feels radioactive. Because once people accept that Africa carried a golden age into Europe, and Europe used it to build dominance, the question changes. It's no longer, why did Africa fall? It becomes, who benefited from Africa being pushed down? That shift is powerful. It reframes history from accident to design, and design implies responsibility. Responsibility is what Europe avoids at all costs. That's why museums still soften language, why textbooks still minimize timelines, why Western civilization skips from Rome to the Renaissance like nothing happened in between. 700 years disappear in a paragraph. Because those 700 years break the spell, they show Europe learning, borrowing, adapting, not leading in isolation. They show Africa as architect, not bystander. And once people see that clearly, the hierarchy loses its authority, because hierarchy relies on inevitability. The Moors exposed contingency. Europe rose because it was taught. Africa fell because access was cut. Those two facts exist together, and they point toward a final reality most people haven't sat with yet. If Africa's golden age once reshaped Europe, and if that knowledge was never destroyed, only displaced, then the question isn't whether Africa can rise again. The question is, who's been afraid of that happening all along? Europe was never afraid of Africa's past. It was afraid of Africa's return, because the past already proved something dangerous, that African systems worked, at scale, across borders, for centuries, not myths, not folklore. Administration, science, law, education. The Moors were the proof of concept, and proof is harder to kill than memory. That's why suppression didn't stop with textbooks. It moved into economics, borders, trade control, language dominance, academic gatekeeping. Europe didn't just rewrite history, it rewired pathways. African knowledge was no longer allowed to circulate freely. It had to pass through European filters, European institutions, European approval. If it didn't count. That's how power stabilizes itself, not by destroying truth, but by controlling who gets to validate it. So Africa was framed as developing, while Europe branded itself developed, as if development is a natural trait, not a process, shaped by access. That framing hides the real story. Europe developed after learning from Africa. Africa was blocked from developing after Europe consolidated power. Those two movements happen together. And once you see that, the modern world starts making sense. Why African nations rich in resources remain poor. Why African history is fragmented in education. Why African excellence is always treated as an exception. It's not because Africa lacks capacity, it's because Africa threatens precedent. The Moors showed what happens when African knowledge is allowed to operate freely. Europe changed, rapidly, permanently. That scared people, because it meant Europe wasn't special by nature, it was situational. So modern power structures are built to prevent that situation from repeating. That's why Africa is encouraged to export raw materials instead of systems, bodies instead of ideas, talent instead of institutions. Because institutions create leverage, and leverage rewrites hierarchies. The Moors had leverage. They controlled education. They controlled translation. They controlled infrastructure. They controlled trade routes. And Europe benefited. Then Europe made sure Africa never controlled those levers again. This is why conversations about catching up are dishonest. You don't catch up to someone who climbed your ladder and then pulled it away. You rebuild your own. And that's where this story starts shifting from history to now. Because the Moors aren't just a medieval chapter. They're a warning. They show what happens when African systems are centered instead of sidelined. When African knowledge is respected instead of extracted. And here's the part most people miss. Europe never fully escaped African influence. It just stopped acknowledging it. The frameworks remain, the structures remain, the foundations remain. That's why Europe still struggles with identity, still debates heritage, still argues about immigration, culture, and belonging, because its origin story is incomplete. And incomplete stories create insecurity, which is why there's resistance when this history resurfaces, why people get defensive, why they argue semantics instead of substance, because deep down, they know this isn't about the past, it's about legitimacy. If Africa once carried a golden age into Europe, if Europe used it to rise, then modern dominance isn't destiny, it's inheritance, and inheritance can be questioned. Which brings us to the final shift in this arc. If the Moors were the carriers, and Africa was the source, what happens when people stop asking permission to reconnect with that source again? Here's the reality Europe never prepared for. Africa doesn't need permission to remember, because the golden age wasn't a favor. It wasn't borrowed. It wasn't imagined. It was built, and then carried into Europe by the Moors when Europe had little to offer in return. That means something critical. Reconnection doesn't require approval. It requires clarity. Once people understand that Africa wasn't introduced to civilization, but exported it, the mental hierarchy breaks. The idea of waiting to be validated by Western institutions starts looking absurd, because validation already happened. 700 years of rule was validation. European transformation was validation. The Renaissance itself was validation. Everything after that was denial. That's why modern resistance to this history isn't subtle. It's emotional, defensive, loud. People don't argue this topic calmly because it threatens legitimacy, not facts. Facts are manageable. Loss of authority is not. The Moors forced Europe into an uncomfortable position. Either admit that Africa shaped its rise, or keep pretending that progress appeared out of thin air. So far, Europe has chosen pretending, but pretending doesn't stop patterns, and patterns are re-emerging. African-led scholarship outside Western institutions, independent research, reclaimed languages, reconnected timelines, diaspora communities stitching together what was deliberately separated. This isn't nostalgia, it's recovery. The same way Europe recovered Greek texts through Moorish Spain, Africa is now recovering its own narrative without intermediaries. And here's the shift that scares people. Once Africa stops being framed as behind, conversations change, aid narratives weaken, superiority myths crack, the moral high ground evaporates. Because you can't posture as a teacher when you were once the student. That's why you'll notice pushback framed as revisionism, agenda, or dangerous rhetoric. Those labels aren't about accuracy, They're about control. The Moors remind the world that control can move, that dominance isn't fixed, that knowledge flows where it's welcomed. Europe welcomed it once, then closed the door. But doors don't lock history forever. Which leads us to the next tension. If the Golden Age never vanished, only shifted locations and names, then where is it now, and who's standing in its way? It moved. That's the part most people miss. Golden Ages don't evaporate, they relocate. They follow stability, resources, and access. Africa's didn't end. It was interrupted, redirected, and absorbed elsewhere. Europe became the beneficiary, not because it was destined, because it positioned itself correctly. The Moors were the transfer point. They carried African systems north, refined them in European soil, and proved they worked outside the continent. Once Europe learned how to run those systems on its own terms, Africa was no longer needed as a partner, only as a supplier. That's when the flow stopped. Knowledge that once moved freely became classified, institutionalized, and guarded. Universities stopped being places of exchange and became places of gatekeeping. Credentials replaced competence. Authority replaced truth. Africa was cut off from its own exports, and Europe called that progress. But here's the contradiction. The Golden Age logic still exists. The methods still exist. The frameworks still exist. The philosophies still exist. They're just branded differently. When you see global finance, you're seeing mathematics refined through African trade networks. When you see modern medicine, you're seeing categorization systems preserved by African scholars. When you see global education models, you're seeing structures tested in Moorish cities. Africa didn't lose the ability to build systems. It lost access to the same uninterrupted environment Europe enjoyed. That's a key difference. Stability creates momentum. Disruption resets progress. Africa didn't fall behind. It was disrupted repeatedly, while Europe consolidated uninterrupted growth on borrowed foundations. That matters, because once people understand that the Golden Age wasn't about skin color but system control, the conversation matures. Africa's power wasn't mystical. It wasn't genetic. It wasn't accidental. It was structural. The Moors didn't rule Europe because they were exotic. They ruled because they were organized. That's the lesson that keeps getting ignored, which is why modern discussions about Africa often miss the point. They focus on charity instead of systems, aid instead of infrastructure, sympathy instead of strategy. The Moors proved that Africa doesn't need saving. It needs sovereignty over its systems again. That's what scares people, because sovereignty breaks dependency, and dependency is profitable, which brings us to the last layer before everything clicks. If Africa's Golden Age still exists in fragments, who controls the fragments today? And who decides whether they ever reconnect? Power today isn't about inventing new systems. It's about controlling old ones. The fragments of Africa's Golden Age didn't vanish. They were collected, cataloged, and centralized, mostly outside Africa. Libraries, museums, universities, financial institutions, archives, think tanks. Control shifted hands. Europe didn't just inherit African systems, it stored them. And storage equals authority. Whoever controls the archive controls the narrative. Whoever controls accreditation controls legitimacy. Whoever controls funding controls which history gets researched and which stays buried. That's why African contributions are often discovered by Western scholars first. Why African artifacts sit behind European glass. Why African knowledge has to be validated externally before it's considered real. That's not coincidence. That's custody. The Moors disrupted that once by being both African and authoritative inside Europe. They didn't need permission. They were the institution. Europe learned from that mistake. It made sure that authority would never again be portable like that. Knowledge would be centralized. Access would be conditional. Recognition would be filtered. Africa would produce. Europe would certify. That's the system we're living in now. And once you see it, modern debates snap into focus. Why African scholars struggle for funding. Why African history is treated as niche. Why global standards are set elsewhere. Because reconnecting the fragments threatens the entire structure. If African systems reconnect, education, finance, governance, culture, The old hierarchy collapses quietly. No war needed, no confrontation required, just alignment. That's why resistance isn't loud. It's bureaucratic. Delays, committees, peer review, insufficient evidence. Needs more sources. All polite ways to slow momentum. The Moors didn't face this problem. They controlled the system outright, which is why their rule feels so uncomfortable in hindsight. It proves that Africa doesn't need external scaffolding to function at the highest level. It already did. And that memory is dangerous, because memory turns into expectation. Expectation turns into demand. Demand turns into change, so the fragments stay fragmented, for now. But fragmentation only works while people believe the pieces are unrelated, and that belief is fading, which leads to the next pressure point. If control today is about who holds the fragments, what happens when technology removes the gatekeepers altogether? Gatekeepers only matter when access is scarce. That era is ending. For centuries, Europe controlled Africa's narrative by controlling access. Who could publish? Who could archive? Who could teach? Who could be taken seriously? If knowledge didn't pass through approved institutions, it didn't exist. That control is slipping. Technology broke the lock. Digitized manuscripts, open archives, independent scholarship, decentralized platforms. The same tools Europe used to consolidate power are now dissolving monopoly over information. And that's not accidental, because once the fragments become visible at the same time, patterns emerge on their own. No permission required, no credential needed. People start noticing timelines lining up, influences overlapping, systems repeating. The Moors stop looking like an anomaly. They look like a bridge between Africa's golden age and Europe's rise. That's why pushback is intensifying now. Not because the history is new, but because access is. You'll hear the same defenses recycled. It's too complex. It's overstated. It's not proven enough. Those aren't academic critiques. They're delay tactics, because complexity buys time, and time preserves power. But power doesn't survive transparency. Once people can trace ideas without intermediaries, authority shifts. Institutions lose their exclusive role as truth brokers. The archive becomes public. That's when history stops being owned. And ownership is the real issue. Europe didn't just want credit. It wanted control over the meaning of progress itself. That's why African excellence is often framed as ancient but not modern, glorious but finished, impressive but irrelevant. The Moors disrupt that framing. They weren't ancient. They weren't primitive. They were contemporary with Europe and ahead of it, which means African capability isn't locked in the past. It's situational, and situations can change. That realization is what people are really reacting to. Not guilt, not blame. Fear. Fear that the hierarchy they inherited isn't stable. Fear that Africa's role in global systems could shift again, because if it happened once, it can happen again. Which brings us to the final stretch of this story. If the gatekeepers are losing control, who benefits from the reconnecting pieces? And who stands to lose the most? This isn't abstract. There are clear winners and losers if the pieces reconnect. The winners are obvious. People who are cut out of the story regain authorship. Africa regains reference power. Diaspora communities stop looking backward with nostalgia and start looking forward with strategy. Because reclaimed history doesn't just restore pride, it restores leverage. When people know their ancestors built systems that work, they stop begging for inclusion. They start building alternatives. They stop chasing validation. They start setting standards. That's dangerous to anyone invested in the current hierarchy. The losers are just as clear. Institutions that rely on monopoly over legitimacy. Narratives that depend on Africa being permanently behind. Power structures that frame dominance as natural instead of inherited. Those structures don't collapse loudly. They weaken quietly. Enrollment drops. Authority gets questioned. Alternative platforms grow. You're already seeing it. That's why debates around African history feel more intense now than ever. Not because the past changed, but because the future is opening. The Moors are central to that opening. They prove that Africa's golden age wasn't mythical. They prove it scaled. They prove it crossed borders. They prove it worked under pressure. And they prove Europe's rise wasn't isolated. That combination changes everything, because once people understand that progress is transferable, not racial, the conversation flips. Africa isn't waiting its turn. It already had one and shared it. Europe didn't invent modernity. It inherited and refined it. That doesn't erase European achievement, but it ends exclusivity. And exclusivity is the real asset at risk, which is why resistance will keep coming, not as outright denial, that's too obvious, but as dilution, as reframing, as both sides, as endless debate, all designed to slow momentum. But momentum doesn't stop once people see the pattern, and the pattern is clear. Africa built systems. The Moors carried them, Europe learned them, then closed the loop. That's the story underneath all the noise, which leaves one final question, the one this entire documentary is really circling. If Africa once exported a golden age that reshaped the world, what happens when it stops exporting fragments and starts exporting systems again? Here's the difference between fragments and systems. Fragments impress. Systems change power. Europe was never afraid of African art, music, or aesthetics. Those are easy to consume, easy to celebrate, easy to detach from control. What Europe feared, and still fears, are African systems returning to scale, because systems don't ask permission. They create gravity. That's what the Moors did. They didn't show up asking Europe to admire African brilliance. They installed African logic into daily life. Education that produced administrators, infrastructure that supported cities, law that managed diversity, trade that linked continents. That's why Europe didn't just benefit, it transformed. And that's the blueprint everyone avoids talking about. Africa's golden age wasn't about isolated geniuses. It was about repeatable structure, training pipelines, knowledge preservation, long-term planning. That's what makes it dangerous, because systems can be rebuilt. And today, the conditions are shifting again. Africa no longer needs European intermediaries to move ideas. Diaspora networks bypass old filters. Capital moves differently. Technology compresses distance. Education is no longer locked behind medieval gates. That changes the equation. For the first time since the Moors, Africa has the potential to export systems without surrendering authorship, and that's why narratives are tightening now. You'll see more attempts to separate African history into neat, disconnected boxes. More insistence that this time is different. More warnings about instability, corruption, and incapacity. Those aren't neutral concerns. They're preemptive breaks, because people in power understand something clearly. Once systems reconnect, dependency collapses. And dependency is the foundation of the modern hierarchy. The Moors didn't dominate Europe by force alone. They dominated by competence. That's the part nobody wants repeated, because competence doesn't need conquest. It attracts. People adopt what works. Europe adopted African systems once because they worked better than what it had. If that happens again, the current order won't survive intact. That's not ideology. That's history repeating its logic. So watch where the resistance shows up, not against African culture, against African organization, not against African expression, against African coordination. That tells you everything. Which brings us to the final internal shift. This story isn't just about Europe or Africa. It's about mindset, because the most effective erasure wasn't physical. It was psychological. And that's what has to be confronted next. If the Moors proved Africa could lead, why were people trained to stop expecting it? The strongest barrier was never armies or borders. It was expectation. Once people stop expecting leadership from a place, they stop preparing for it. They stop building toward it. They stop trusting it. That's how erasure finishes its job. After the Moors, Africa wasn't just removed from power. It was removed from possibility. Leadership was reframed as foreign, authority as external, progress as something that arrives, not something that originates. That framing didn't happen overnight. It was trained through education that downplayed African systems, through media that framed African success as anomaly, through language that described Africa in terms of problems, not patterns. Over time, that training worked. People internalized the hierarchy. That's the part nobody likes to admit, because psychological conditioning doesn't feel like oppression. It feels like realism. It's just how things are. That's not our lane. We're not there yet. Those phrases are learned. The Moors disprove them all. They show Africa operating at the highest level in the most competitive environment of its time, Europe, and succeeding for centuries. That should reset expectation. But resetting expectation is dangerous because expectation drives behavior and behavior drives outcomes. So the story was softened, the timeline blurred, the achievements reframed as foreign influence rather than African export. The result? People admire the Moors without identifying with them. That's the lock. Admiration without ownership. Once that breaks, everything changes. Because when people see the Moors not as them, but as us, the mental ceiling lifts. Leadership stops feeling like rebellion. It feels like restoration. That's why this history matters now. Not for nostalgia, not for pride, for orientation. People move differently when they know where they come from and what that origin produced. Europe understood that. That's why it protected its myth so fiercely. Africa is just beginning to undo that protection, which leads to the final question of the entire documentary. If the lock was psychological, what does unlocking actually look like? In real terms, not theory, unlocking isn't symbolic, it's practical. It doesn't start with monuments or slogans. It starts with behavior changing at scale. Because the Moors didn't rule Europe by affirmations, they ruled by systems. So unlocking today doesn't look like arguing history online. It looks like rebuilding the same levers that once gave Africa gravity: education, coordination, standards, and continuity. Education first. Not just access to information, but control over curriculum. Teaching history as a connected timeline, not scattered trivia. Training people to build institutions, not just survive them. The Moors didn't produce followers. They produced administrators. People who could run cities, manage economies, preserve knowledge, and train replacements. That's why their rule lasted centuries. Continuity matters. Europe learned that lesson well. Institutions outlive individuals. Africa's disruption came from breaking continuity, constant resets, external interference, leadership turnovers without succession planning. Unlocking means designing for longevity again. Not personalities, processes. Then coordination. The Moors unified regions without erasing difference. Law, trade, language, and scholarship created shared operating systems. That's how multi-ethnic societies function without collapsing. Fragmentation weakens power. Alignment multiplies it. That lesson hasn't changed. And finally, standards. Europe didn't dominate by being creative alone. It dominated by setting standards, legal, academic, economic, and forcing the world to operate inside them. The Moors once set standards Europe followed. That's the part history avoids. Unlocking means setting standards again instead of chasing approval. None of this requires nostalgia. It requires clarity. Africa's golden age wasn't magic. It was discipline. And discipline can be relearned. That's what makes this moment different from the past. For the first time since the Moors, Africa has access to tools that bypass traditional gatekeepers: direct knowledge exchange, independent capital flows, cross-border collaboration without colonial intermediaries. The ingredients are there. What's missing is expectation. Expectation that leadership is normal. Expectation that excellence is repeatable. Expectation that systems can be owned. That's the final unlock. Because once people expect power, they prepare for it. And once they prepare for it, history stops repeating and starts continuing. Which brings us to the final moment. Not a question about the past, a question about choice. If the Moors once carried Africa's golden age into Europe, and the blueprint still exists, do people want restoration, or are they still more comfortable with fragments? This is where the story stops being historical. Because everything up to this point already happened. Africa built systems. The Moors carried them. Europe used them, then locked the door. Those facts aren't changing. What changes now is response, and that's the part nobody can outsource. Restoration isn't guaranteed. It's optional. Fragments are comfortable. They let people feel inspired without feeling responsible. You can celebrate African brilliance without reorganizing your thinking. You can admire the Moors without asking why their model worked or why it hasn't been rebuilt at scale since. Fragments feel safe. Systems demand commitment. That's why history was broken into pieces in the first place. Pieces don't threaten power, systems do. Europe understood that deeply. That's why it didn't just take African knowledge. It absorbed it into institutions, universities, banks, legal codes, trade networks, military organization, continuity structures. That's how dominance lasts. Not through genius, through infrastructure. The Moors showed what happens when Africa controls infrastructure. Not aesthetics, not symbolism. Infrastructure. And the results were undeniable. 7 centuries, multi-ethnic stability, explosive intellectual growth, cities that outpaced Europe for generations. That wasn't luck, it was design. So the real question at the end of this documentary isn't whether the Moors ruled Europe. They did. It's not whether Africa had a golden age. It did. The question is whether people are willing to stop treating that knowledge like a museum exhibit and start treating it like a manual. Because manuals require application. Application creates disruption, and disruption forces accountability. That's what makes this moment uncomfortable. You can't unknow this story. You can't unsee the pattern. You can't pretend Africa's role was minor once you follow the flow honestly, so excuses shrink. What replaces them is responsibility. Responsibility to stop asking, why aren't we there yet? And start asking, what systems are we rebuilding? Because Europe didn't wait for permission. The Moors didn't wait for validation. They built where they stood. That's the inheritance people keep overlooking, not pride, capability. Africa's golden age wasn't about glory. It was about function. And function can be restored, but only if people stop romanticizing the past and start operationalizing it. That's the fork in the road. One path keeps history as entertainment. The other turns it into strategy. One path stays safe. The other changes power dynamics quietly, permanently. Europe chose systems. That's why it rose. Africa once chose systems too. That's why it led. The Moors proved what happens when those systems move. So now the question isn't about Europe anymore. It's about choice. Do people want to keep consuming fragments of greatness? Or are they ready to rebuild the kind of systems that once carried Africa's golden age across continents and reshaped the world? Because history already gave the answer once. What remains is whether anyone is willing to use it again.